We were talking about manipulation, we were talking about algorithms, mediation, engagement, space versus screen, post-internet art. I would like to ask, who is afraid of digital art? And by meaning that, I mean, who is the audience for digital art? Who are the producers of digital art? And if you can just think of thoughts from your experience.
Digital art and the audiences have always been there. The terminology that we use has changed and how we describe the work, that's changed, but I think the audiences stayed the same. So I'm not sure that there's a separate audience for digital art. It's there for everybody. It's very popularist.
I think the intersection between art, technology, science, I think is becoming a lot more blurred, particularly in terms of sort of art, design, technology, science, all of these things. If you look at, again, a lot of the exhibitions that are happening around digital art, there is some relationship there, and that can be used to make it more accessible and open it up to wider audiences. So naturally you have a much wider, broader audience if you do have all of these disciplines working together. It's just how you present that and how you work with that. That's the main thing. And whether you do huge exhibitions which try to address all of it, or you try and access a theme or an issue around it is, I don't know, a starting point at least. But I don't think there's in any way a separate audience. I think that as digital culture becomes a lot less in the realm of the curator and a lot more in the realm of the people who consume it, then of course it's going to become a bit more blurred. But
I'm less interested or less worried about digital art that can fit into gallery spaces. I think that sort of as you can see from Decode at the V&A or Digital Revolution at the Barbican, there's space for digital art to be curated, showcased, sort of wrapped into the programs of existing arts institutions. I think where we don't know the answer is, where does digital art that's conceived to live on and be consumed on the internet go? Like, who are the curators of that? Is there an audience for it? Who pays the marketing budgets of the, you can't just stick something up and tweet it and hope that 10,000 people get there. So I think the space is a really interesting step in that direction, sort of trying to build a virtual gallery for this work.
I mean, the issue you have with is the preservation of digital work online. So I think there's the Rhizome Archive project, which is currently looking at what the possibilities are, because you have things like legacy systems and software and things that just goes out of date, that digital work is supposed to exist on. So how do you constantly make sure you're staying ahead of that I don't know, dinosaur software?
As you said before, who's frightened of digital art, and I would definitely say it's conservators. So I've done quite a lot of work collaborating with our with our conservation team and studio, thinking about how we do conserve the works, because traditionally in a museum context, when you acquire work, it's for longevity, it's for future generations, and it's very hard to kind of identify how long that software or hardware is going to last.
A lot of services, such as like YouTube and SoundCloud, kind of give the opportunity to people to put media, such as video and audio, online. I kind of personally feel like there's a lot more to offer out there in terms of digital art on the web. I mean, as like, for you guys, like, what do you think the purpose is of using these like third-party services to kind of put work up that you could access with other medias?
Myself, I've spent a lot of time learning to code and running Linux, and my PowerPoint was open source. Oh yeah, that's a good example. My PowerPoint was the only ODP file, which is an open source PowerPoint, but of course it's displayed on a MacBook on an OS, so that's a proprietary system. It's very hard to sort of to fight against that. Like, even when making our shows for Life Gallery, I can make the website, but then Cedric will upload something on YouTube, and then someone's going to view it on a Chrome browser on a Mac OS. You're increasingly implicated in these kind of platforms that are going to sell, not even only sell your data, but emotionally manipulate you, as we found out a couple of weeks ago. How I don't think you can step out of them. I think there's a lot to be said for trying to find ways to do that, but I think it's good to kind of antagonize the ways that people will take YouTube for granted as a democratizing service to display your videos on the web, when in many ways it sort of entraps as many people as it gives a voice to.
I think for us it's so digital technologies are just part of the toolbox now. We spend half a day on the computer or whatever, and then it's just like using a pencil or a sander. It's all part of the same thing, and I think it's sort of normal. I feel like it's normal for us to be using digital technologies when everybody's using them all the time anyway. It's not so much a conscious decision. It's more like that's what's practically available and current now, is to be using these things.
Just about digital art, do you feel that having a physical manifestation is as important as sort of permeating all of the social media platforms and sort of permeating the internet to really get your art out there and get the message across?
I think we are like sculptors and we just use the digital as another tool. So it's not that we're necessarily, I guess, where we consider it eventually going is a different thing, but we do a lot of sketch work, and that might be like constructing things within like Maya or Cinema 4D, or like doing films or making animations, and there's a whole load of work that happens, but actually there's not that much that we do about the final platform for it to be shown at, if that makes sense. It's only when we get offered those platforms that we think about then how do we take these elements that we've been working on and how do we construct them to respond to that space, and it is responding to the space specifically, whether it's online, whether it's virtual, whether it's real.
Obviously there is a bit of a transition happening to putting a lot of content online and promoting exhibitions as well through your online channels. But how do you, if we do make a bigger and bigger move towards those kind of channels, what do you do about the audience that are still offline, like older people or people who just don't have access to computers or people who just don't understand digital art? Do you isolate them or do you try and integrate them? What would you suggest?
I don't know. I feel like there's a risk of being patronising to that audience. I remember I was talking to Matt Pike, the artist who created the animation tool, and I asked him what does he think makes good digital art good, and his response was he thinks the best digital art is that where you can't see the technology, where it's stripped away. And I think that applies sort of equally to pieces of engagement. So if you've got an audience member, and it doesn't need to be someone old who's coming into a gallery and you've got something on an iPad for them, then it should be fairly intuitive. You shouldn't need to grapple with technology. And if you do, then in some ways I don't think it's that complicated a question. I think you just have a good host alongside there going, oh, try that, and let them go from there.
I just have a question for maybe all of you. I think when exploring and when discussing the term the digital, I think it becomes quite apparent that the digital is some sort of umbrella term. And I just wonder if any of you see any problematics in that umbrella term, that you could talk about the art object, the digital object, the virtual object, but also the digital as a form of mediation and as a platform of communication.
I think yes, it's just the answer to that question. It's a deeply frustrating word, and I feel like everybody knows what they mean when they say it, but they don't mean what it actually means. And I'm really, really hopeful that in 5 years or in 10 years, we just don't use it most of the time. It's as useful a word as physical or analog, but we know what we mean when we say physical or analog, but we don't with digital. At the moment, we just mean new things we should be doing something about. And that's fine. Like, it's provoking a lot of really interesting progress, experiments, innovations, but I think we need to develop a much richer vocabulary for what we mean.
Just adding on to this idea about terminology, and so the collection that I work with, the early one that I mentioned at the beginning, is referred to as the computer art collection, and in the V&A's terminology it very much refers to a specific period of time, so between like the early 60s and the mid 80s, where people went from creating their own code to using proprietary software. But I think it's interesting to think that many of the computer artists, as they were then called, rejected the term because they didn't necessarily just want to be defined by the medium that they used. And I think the same goes for digital today. We're in danger, obviously, of ghettoizing it to a certain extent, but that's not to detract from the way in which works are made. This goes back to what you were saying before, whether it's just a tool like any other, or whether computational processes do inform some artists' work, so there's no easy answer, sorry.
I'm just wondering about the perishability of digital art, whether in fact it's an opportunity. The expiration date, whether it's an opportunity for it to be renewed or a point for collaborations or departures or audience engagement, and whether artists would start making things with the expiration date in view, and whether audiences would also get that, so this rhythm would almost bring them together and create possibilities.
You might have pointed out a minute ago, there's a piece of work, I can't remember who it's by, where the original, the very first kind of one of the early web art projects, which now doesn't work because, and it actually froze, or the screen froze. So it's kind of rendered in this permanent screen freeze because the software doesn't work anymore. So the restorers and the people who then want to take it back had an updated version of it. I think that might have been...
Seeing Double, it's a really interesting exhibition that was in New York, years ago, sorry. So Seeing Doubles was an exhibition, and it was the original artworks followed by recreations of those artworks. So I'd really recommend checking that out. Can't remember who curated it, sorry.
So I think it is that issue with ephemerality and how we work with that as curators and as people who do kind of, I mean, we as a digital culture agency don't have a permanent collection, so we don't have that much experience with it, but we do commission digital work. And we're fully aware that 20 Hertz by Semiconductor could fail at any time, because what happens if YouTube suddenly stops working, if that suddenly, if basically the browsers update and then you can't play that particular video anymore. These are all things that we have to consider, but I think it's because digital art is something that changes all the time and doesn't stay in that static state, that's one of its weird advantages in some way, that we can actually address the digital through the work that and the culture we produce.
When you access digital content, what you're doing is you're downloading it temporarily, at the very least, to your computer. And nothing really gets deleted unless it gets written over on a hard drive. So in a sense, wouldn't you say that digital content could potentially exist indefinitely, since people have different copies, different duplicates, so to speak, on individual machines?
The question of copyright that obviously comes into it, because you said, everyone will have lots of copies of it, and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I think that's the issue with the first digital art exhibition, the Philips, the Paddles On one, where because there's one of the great things about obviously digital art is that you can weirdly decentralize it, so that hundreds of people can have loads of copies on different operating systems with different specifications, which weirdly means that you do have this like dissipated history of work somewhere being, but obviously getting it all together is very different. But I mean, that idea of copyright and whether you can buy and own digital art is an entirely different thing, because I still find it problematic. But
question, I just had an idea, I just want to bounce it off you, see the reaction. Yeah, how about Spotify for digital art?
No, do you have anything? No, there's a ridiculous, I think it's called a platform called Artsy, which is like known as the Pandora for art or something, where if you like this art, then you can like this art, and no. So, there's a lot of really interesting stuff about Spotify that I could go into in terms of algorithms and nostalgia, but I think that's more like a drink in the bar conversation than anything else. But that's what happens when you do have things where you put in algorithms to mediate culture. You're basically handing over culture to engineers who are taught the most logical way of dealing with it, so we'll throw you back the most logical answer, because half the time we haven't actually looked at what the culture of engineering is, why they think this is still a problem that can be solved via algorithms or via recommendation engines. But yeah, it's another question entirely, I think.
Well, we need to finish, but we are really hope to initiate some kind of digital platform, so I hope we can all continue this online.